Brett McKay here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. So a while back ago, we had on the podcast Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. He wrote the book On Killing, where he goes into detail about the psychological effects that killing has on soldiers and law enforcement officers. And since his book, there hasn't been too much else written about the topic of killing in the context of war. I imagine because it's an unpleasant topic to think, research, and write about. But our guest today has recently published an Amazon Kindle book called The Kill Switch, in which he interviews and talks to soldiers and veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and asks them what it was like to kill and what effect it's had on them and their lives after their service. Our guest is Phil Zabriskie. He has spent nearly a decade working and doing journalism overseas. He has covered both Afghanistan and Iraq, along with news and events in Pakistan, Israel, the Palestinian territories, Indonesia, and the Philippines. He's been a staff writer for Time Magazine. He's written for the National Geographic, the New York Magazine, Washington Post, and he recently, again, his book is The Kill Switch, and that's what we're going to talk about today. A really fascinating discussion. So let's do this. Phil Zabriskie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So your book is The Kill Switch. It's about killing in combat, particularly in the recent Afghanistan and Iraq wars. But can you tell us about your work that led up to this book and what caused you? Was there something specific that caused you to write this little Amazon Kindle single?
Sure. I had not set out to cover conflict. That wasn't my intention to, and I don't think of myself as a war correspondent in any shape or form. It just so happened that I think like a number of people of my generation, so to speak, got caught in this slipstream that happened after September 11th and led to more stories that had to do with conflict. So I'd been spending time in conflict zones in a host of different countries, looking primarily at how people were affected by what was going on around them, and primarily civilians, the people who were living through it. And I went to Afghanistan first and then later to Iraq, and mainly was unembedded. I wasn't doing military. I wasn't focused on the military, but trying to cover the broader story. And this is when I worked for Time Magazine, so I was part of bureaus in these places and part of teams that were collectively trying to cover these things. But I did, on a few occasions, spend time with the military and did, especially 2004, when the war was really turning, wind up in some firefights and saw some people who were wounded and killed, saw soldiers and Marines coming back after being in firefights and got a sense of how they responded and how what had just happened or what had been happening over the previous weeks or months was affecting them or weighing them. I saw some instances where civilians got shot. One in particular was a man who got shot in the face when he drove through a checkpoint, probably out of panic. And the guys who shot him were incredibly distraught. So, there was a whole range of things going on that very clearly showed there was much more than just what happened on that day. And I did one story in particular about combat stress, which was an effort. It had to do with, in part, an effort the military was making to put counselors closer to the front line so they could talk to guys as things were happening in case anything came up that might make them less combat ready or might be particularly troubling, whatever the case might be. So the psychological issues in the moment and beyond were very much on my mind. And then later years, I went back to Afghanistan several times. I spent time in Israel and the Palestinian territories, including Gaza and some other places touched by conflict. And even when the wars were over, ostensibly, you could still see the traces of them. You could see the impact, and it was quite clear that they would last far beyond the time when the last bullet was fired. And when I moved back to the States a few years back, I was always reading and watching the coverage of the wars, and there was amazing work done and some great books, great documentaries, things like that. But oftentimes it felt like something was missing. And to me, that piece that was missing, especially in coverage of the U.S. forces over there, was the killing. It seemed like it was not talked about as much as it was being done. It seemed like a real blind spot. I had myself gotten married and had a daughter, so I wasn't about to go back to these conflict zones. But looking at this question gave me a way to continue to address it, because I did not feel done with it. I didn't feel it was done with me, so to speak. But I wanted to keep working on this, and this was a way of doing it. And then I got lucky in that some of the people I contacted were willing to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, that's the interesting thing is that the only other book that I am aware of that goes into the psychology of killing is David Grossman's book on killing. But for the most part, people don't like to talk about this aspect of war. What is that? I mean, that's why we go to war, right? I mean, that's sort of like we try to avoid conflict and we want to avoid it. But in the end, you're there to inflict harm on the enemy so they stop inflicting harm on you. What's with the reluctance, particularly in modern times, of talking about that?
I think it's psychologically it's a very dark subject. I mean, it's not the easiest thing to look at, and I know that my wife could tell you this, over the time I was really deep into this stuff. I wasn't in the greatest mood, and it certainly affected me. I think as political leaders, they're not going to talk about it because they don't really want that piece of it being considered. If the public's trying to decide, are they for this or against this? Even in the military, they don't talk about it all that much because at least the psychological piece of it and the potential for its lingering afterwards, because they might lose some people, and it just kind of gets in the way of doing the job in certain ways. So all of that combines, but some other factors as well. It's just something that gets left out, and I think also a country is probably not terribly anxious to look at the killing it's doing, because you can say it's this soldier or this Marine or this Navy SEAL, but in a way they're fighting for us. They're fighting in our name, so it's kind of all of us are involved in it one way or another.
Yeah. So in your book, you mentioned the study. It's a very famous study done in World War II or after World War II by S.L.A. Marshall. And the conclusion of that study is that 75% of soldiers during World War II or in combat never fired at the enemy. They either fired over the head or just didn't even aim. In recent years, those numbers have been called into question, and that it wasn't that high. But has there been any updated studies on the reluctance of soldiers to fire at the enemy?
Not that I know of, but I mean, if you look at just, and I, of course, know about the controversy you're talking about. I mentioned Marshall in the story. I didn't really get into. I mean, I mentioned that there's controversy about his numbers, but I didn't really want to get into it all that much because I'm not really qualified to judge his work. But I did say that even if half of that number was true in a war against Adolf Hitler's Nazi soldiers, that's pretty remarkable. And it would suggest a very strong reluctance to take life, especially if you can see someone who's right in front of you. At the same time, though, you look at World War II, tens of millions of people were killed. In World War I, tens of millions of people were killed. And I don't know that I certainly hope we won't ever have a war like that again. But I doubt it. I mean, now we're talking thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And it's a huge, huge number. But you're not having cities that get carpet, maybe outside, maybe in Syria you are, but you're not, largely having cities getting carpet bombed as a matter of course, as a tactic of as a accepted tactic of military strategy. But overall, there's just not a whole lot of studies on this sort of thing. I mean, killing in general, not that I could find or located. There were a handful, but the military, when I contacted them, they said they didn't track how many soldiers kill other people. They didn't track how it affects them afterwards, and there's a chance that's not true, and that they don't talk about that stuff because of the body count stuff that happened in Vietnam, during Vietnam. But it's pretty surprising to me because, I mean, even if, like you say, it's part of their job, it's part of what they need to do. So you figure as an organization that wanted to track its performance, they would look at these things. You have Grossman. More recently, a woman named Shira McGowan, I think is how you say her name, at the San Francisco VA, or one of the San Francisco VAs, has done some studies showing that soldiers who kill are twice as likely to deal with PTSD and other mental health issues as those who don't. It's not that everyone is going to be deeply affected by it, but I had a West Point instructor tell me that, or phrase it as killing being the biggest moral decision one can make and the biggest moral taboo one can break. So it stands to reason that those who killed other people will be carrying something that those who did not are free of. They may have their own catalog of traumatic incidents that they've encountered, but that wouldn't be one of them. And in this past war in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the nature of the enemy and the nature of the fight, you also have a lot of people who aren't really sure if they killed somebody or not. You would come back and they would say, well, I think I got somebody, but they couldn't really see them. And, an IED would go off and some gunfire would come out of an alley or something like that, and they'd shoot towards it, but they might never see anyone there. So you have a lot of people who may come home, and even when they get asked, if they're ever asked about it, they may not be sure what the answer is.
So we may not know the exact number of, how reluctant, what percentage of people in combat, actually don't fire at the enemy, but it is the military understands that there is a reluctance to kill other humans. And you talk about what the military has done over the years to train soldiers to prepare themselves to kill. Can you talk about a bit of that training that has developed since World War II?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this being their job and part of the job, I think they put a lot of effort into designing programs that will help their charges carried out. One way to put it is that they want people getting into combat, feeling almost as if they've been there before, like it had happened before. So whatever they have to do is a series of learned memories and habits more than trying to figure something out for the first time. So back in the training, when that starts, almost from day one, there's a process where the military is creating a context in which killing and dying will make sense, and then also training in the mechanisms needed to carry it out. So you might have, or you do have, language being a big part of it, where, and even in boot camp, an order will be given, and instead of saying yes, they'll say kill, like, run that hill, kill, run that, that's the response. And there's a lot of talk. Are you a killer? Or, can you be a killer? You're not a killer, and that sort of stuff, where it sort of becomes everyday language, and it normalizes something that would have, I think, been very abnormal prior to that. There's jokes that kind of devalue life a little bit, and again make it almost like a softer sell. And then you have chaplains and superior officers who are on hand to talk about some of the philosophical or even religious aspects of it, just the distinction between thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not murder, how that, if it's thou shalt not murder, then there's some space to kill in the right contexts. And to say that killing can be protecting, an act of protection, whereby you protect the guys you're with, but also perhaps even, you kill more, you end the war sooner, fewer people die, things like that. And that it all fits into this warrior ethos where it's part of the duty, part of looking after each other, part of upholding the oath they've taken. And then at the same time, you've got the physical aspects, learning to handle weapons, learning to fire those weapons, clean those weapons, become very familiar with them, then firing them in certain conditions, under stress, then specific scenarios, and moving up from paper targets to human-shaped targets to ever more lifelike facsimiles of actual people, and then even some drills that involve other people playing insurgents. And as the war went on, you had more and more commanders realizing, I need to do more than just the basic training, so they would call in specialists who could create villages with fake insurgents, and they would have special effects and bombings and sort of things like that to, again, make it feel like they've been there before. And one of the units that I looked at in the story, or one of the main guys was in the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, which fought in Fallujah in 2004. And they, before they deployed for that battle, worked with a Hollywood studio guy who made this kind of village. And they had a Vietnam veteran and a guy who'd worked with the New York Police Department for a long time come out as well and talk to them about urban combat in particular and how to conduct themselves in that specific environment. And he had this mantra that he gave them, which was slow is smooth, smooth is fast, never make an uncover move, and see the motherfucker and kill the motherfucker and quit thinking about it. And all of that was designed to say, don't panic, remember your responsibilities. If it comes to that, just take care of business and carry on. And I've heard, and I know Grossman has said that hunters have a leg up on this because they maybe have had an experience of having killed another being before, and that makes some sense. But I think it's kind of limited, or only applicable to a point when you're in these actual places and there's actual people in front of you.
I thought it was interesting. You highlight one of the soldiers who killed an insurgent, and he talked about it like it was a training exercise. He saw the target, and he just sort of like habit reflex came in, and he just followed through. Like it was like he was back in the States training for this, and that's what it was like.
Right. Yeah, he said he raised the rifle, took the shot, then lowered the rifle, and looked for the next target. And I think his exact words was, it was like a 25-meter target at that moment. And then it was only later on when he was looking back at it did he think like, oh, that was actually a person.
So throughout the book, you talk to several soldiers and veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan war about their experience on killing. My first question, how do you bring a topic up like that? Like, how do you broach the subject with a soldier on that?
In this case, I think it made a huge difference that I had been over there and that I'd met these guys before. I'm not going to claim we were friends or that I knew them well or spent, there's a lot of people who spent more time over there than I did, and a lot of people who were in many, many more firefights than I was. But just even having some experience and them knowing they saw you there, like in a way I'd gone to their place of work to learn about what they did. That I think that engendered a level of understanding that was very helpful. And then, really I just asked them. I was very upfront about what I was trying to do. I wasn't trying to, pretend I was talking about one thing and then ask them about this. I was very clear that I understood it was not a small thing to be asking them to discuss publicly. And then, I said that I just wanted to look at this squarely and soberly. I didn't want to make I didn't want to sensationalize anything. I didn't want to say, oh, this is crazy. These people are killing. They're bloodthirsty, whatever. I just wanted to understand how this was playing out for them when they were deployed and then afterwards. And I think something about that existing trust was, I guess, made them feel somewhat comfortable or at least willing to try to do this. And then I would go do the interviews and do long interviews, and often in many cases, and there wasn't really any one kind of answer that would come out when I would ask them about this specific stuff, but they were frank and they were forthcoming, and in certain instances it almost felt like they wanted to talk about it, like they were glad to have the chance because there'd been so little opportunity before, other than, maybe they're on an airplane and someone says, hey, did you kill anyone? That kind of stuff that is really reductive and that a lot of guys really hate. Yeah.
Was there a story that you heard from one of the soldiers you interviewed that was particularly jarring?
Well, there were a lot of stories, and I think there were, a few things that I recalled from my experience that I'd maybe packed away and hadn't thought, consciously tried not to think about for a while. And I think that, at one point, a former battalion commander says that when war is declared, guys will inevitably be put in impossible positions where they have to make choices that are extremely difficult. And there's one guy in the story who, during the initial invasion, his unit, they were fighting Iraqi soldiers in southern Iraq, and they killed one, and then everyone turned away except for him. He had to sort of watch that spot, and then a kid ran up and picked his gun up and pointed at the Marines, and so he shot him, and that was his job. That was within the rules of engagement. But it's shocking, there's just no way that's kind of right in any moral sense, and everyone knows that. It's not as if, and for some of those reasons, he had trouble even telling anyone about it for a long time. He didn't tell the other guys that day. He didn't tell them, because it just felt wrong. And when guys were all excited and they felt like they were making progress towards Baghdad and they were carrying out their mission as they were supposed to, even some guys who would say, yeah, I took out a nester, I took out a sniper, I took out this or that or the other. He said, I'm not going to say like I just took out a 7-year-old. So, and it also became clear over time like how much that weighed on him too. So, stories like that are I think implicitly going to be the most jarring. But there were quite a few others that are shocking in different ways as well.
Yeah, you talk about in the book how one philosopher calls those sorts of decisions and the effects of them a moral wound, and not necessarily a psychological wound, because some of these guys, they don't have any really PTSD, but there's something that's bothering them. How has their experience in Afghanistan or Iraq affected them in their post-military life, and how are they dealing with what they did there? What's the common response there?
I tried to resist I knew I couldn't answer those questions, like in terms of the military or in terms of veterans. I in part tried to focus on a couple of specific people because I knew it's going to be different depending on who you're talking to, and it's going to be different depending on their circumstances, how they came back, when they came back, what they did afterwards. When you talk about moral injury, the term that was coined by Jonathan Shea, who wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam, which is a terrific book about what happens when the process of coming home, of being in war and then coming home, and that's when you have a situation where something you did so thoroughly and deeply transgresses your sense of right and wrong that it is akin to an injury, a psychological injury that can be in some cases debilitating, because you sort of walk around wanting to think you are this sort of person or that sort of person, but somewhere in your head you think, oh, I did that thing though, and I will always be the person who did that thing. How can I pretend I'm this or that? And like I say, another psychiatrist said that a lot of guys, it's almost they treat killings as like a personal trial, and they put themselves on trial in their mind, and they have to figure out, was it just, was it right, was it effective, was it, in some cases, some might be thinking in the long run, was it worth it? And how that they judge themselves on that scale can matter as well. With the two guys that I focused on, one who was in the 2-5 Marines, Ben Nelson, he was wounded. And he was wounded in an incident where everyone else in his Humvee was killed when they were ran by a car bomber in November of 2004. So he went to Germany for treatment. He went back to D.C. for treatment, or Bethesda, Maryland for treatment, and then back to the West Coast where he was based. And he was almost by himself. I mean, he was still connected to the Marines, but he couldn't fight. He couldn't be part of his unit. His best friends and his company commander, had just been killed, and he blamed himself for that. His commander told him not to shoot at the bomber, explicitly said, "Do not shoot at that car," but he still felt that it was his fault in part, and so just his own surviving was an affront in a way. So he was a bit adrift, and he struggled a lot, and it's taken years for him to get right with certain things, and only finally did he get some help from a very attentive and from what I can tell, quite insightful counselor through the VA. But this was just a couple of years ago. Meanwhile, the other guy, Brian Chantosh, he'd been scheduled to rotate out of Iraq before the Battle of Fallujah in late 2004, but he talked his way into staying with his guys because he wanted to lead them into that battle. But towards the end of it, he was actually sent home according to his orders, and it was 2 days maybe of plane rides and car rides before he was back in the Baltimore airport with the same boots he was wearing, in Fallujah just days earlier, with some of that same dirt and some of that same blood on them. But he stayed in the military. He had an instruction role as an instructor at the basic school. He had other roles in the following years, and then eventually worked at the Naval Academy as a company commander and almost like a mentor in a lot of ways to midshipmen, the cadets there, not the cadets, sorry, the midshipmen at the Naval Academy, who in all likelihood were going to be going to war at some point and be leading other men. So he had a structure around him that I think was extremely helpful. And then eventually these midshipmen started asking him questions about his own experience, which provided a forum in which he could talk about these things and look at them himself and consider them. At the same time, he also was going 100 miles an hour all the time, as he admits. His marriage fell apart. He says it was his fault. He kind of neglected his family to a certain extent. And later he said he was affected by, he didn't want to say he didn't say he had PTSD or something like that, but he said he was affected by what came out of his combat experience in a way that he needed to get a little bit of help. And he did get some help, but it was all within the military structure, which I think was extremely important and very beneficial for him.
So I guess a lesson from there, would be that don't let these soldiers be by themselves. Keep them in some sort of structure when they get back.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of these guys are, like Chantosh is a career soldier. He was in 20 years. He only recently retired last year. He was older when he went to battle, so he had a bit more of a maturity about him, a bit more ability to put things in a broader perspective than some of these guys who are 19 or 20. But then, many of them do their service and they're out, and then they have to go find other things when they're in their early 20s, or mid 20s maybe. And doing these things in isolation is really difficult. Doing things where, because you're already in a situation where what you were just doing over there makes little sense over here, and the contexts are so different. Like, that alone can be jarring. Yet you're walking around this world wherever you are. You're in your car, you're at the mall, you're at your job, and people are talking about other things. So that thing that was most important to you, that was really life and death, literally, to you days earlier, is inconsequential, or seems inconsequential to the people around you. So even on that social context, exactly, like, that isolation can be damaging. Some people like it. I mean, some people really don't want to talk about it, and they've got a way to make sense of it on their own. But the guys who need help, having them adrift, and here's another aspect of the whole VA problem, which is that having them wait for months for an appointment, or just being handed some pills, or whatever it might be, just these limited Band-Aid type approaches to counseling or treatment, or even just listening, can be even further isolating.
So yeah, I guess goes to my next question. I mean, we know that the military does a lot to help a soldier actually kill, but I mean, it sounds like they don't do too much to help these guys deal with it afterwards.
No, not explicitly, and I heard that from a lot of people, soldiers, psychiatrists, counselors, various sorts of people who study the military, and it's hard. Yeah, it just seems like it's not very well, and I don't know if it's just not very well understood, or they don't have the money or the time to pay attention to these sorts of things, or they don't really want guys thinking about them ahead of time, because again, you would have a situation where, I think, from what I understand, I think it'd be really hard to go into a place and be killing other people when you're thinking like, hey, I wonder if that guy has a family, or I wonder if this is going to bother me later. I wonder if I'm going to see that guy's face in a couple of years when I have a dream, or when I, smell something similar, or hear a truck backfire and there's a similar sound. All those things can make someone hesitate, and if they hesitate, then they might not achieve their objective, and someone else could get hurt. Things could go wrong in one way or another, and they are, as Chanta says, we are a tool of the government in the violent realm, and that's what they have to be readied for. That's the job they're supposed to do, that they signed up for, and that they take pride in doing well. At the same time, though, you have this sense of moral injury, where something that they just did something that is hard to feel good about over the long term. Ben Nelson says that in dealing with people he killed, he wishes there had been some lessons about it ahead of time, like some warning that this might happen, because for years he said he was just angry. He had this rage inside him. He was anxious and frustrated every time he thought about it, and he didn't have any way to contextualize what was going on with him. So he was just dealing with it on his own, and he was lucky in that he has a kind of incredibly mature and steadfast wife who fought through it all with him. But some have not been so lucky.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, as it goes on, it can get harder. You might want to think that this gets easier to deal with, like, because you care, over time you get used to it, and it starts. It becomes clear, like, what it was all about and why. You can contextualize. And a guy like Chantash has a very effective and impressive, in a way, ability to compartmentalize things. Like, that's what happened there and then, and that's why we did it, and this is today, and so I'm doing this other thing. But not everyone can do that. If they could teach soldiers that, then that might be better for them. I don't know if it'd be better for everyone else, but later on in life, you're thinking some of those thoughts, like, I wonder if that guy had a family. I wonder if what could have been in his life, or what happened there, or was it worth it? And especially with the question of wars like this one, or Vietnam, where the outcome is, equivocal at best, where you can't say, yeah, we did that so we could beat back the Nazis, but there's some real questions about whether it was a success or not. That factors in as well. And already now you had, I saw these guys on consecutive days in January, and it was days after insurgents had retaken Fallujah and Ramadi. And a whole host of questions came up around that with veterans. And when I asked these guys about it, and again, this speaks to the different kinds of personalities involved, and the different perspectives, Chantaj said, well, that was then and there, and we did our best, and this is unfortunate that it turned out this way, but it's not going to make me think differently about my service. And Ben Nelson said, well, then what did those guys die for?
Yeah. I think you mentioned a statistic about how it gets harder the longer you go, that most of the suicides from veterans are veterans over 50 years old. So these are men who fought in Vietnam. So,
right.
Yeah. And I guess they're sort of dealing with their mortality.
Yeah, I think it comes up. I mean, you start thinking, what have I accomplished? What may I have to answer for, based on whatever your faith is, and then however you think you may pass through this life to the next. What was all that for? And is this good? And does the disenchantment, does the isolation, or that feeling of whatever it might be, does it just increase, or does it ever get better? So, and I think that in a way now, this is pure supposition, but I think in a way now it's, the Vietnam War has been supplanted by these wars. So those guys are almost afterthoughts in a way that I would imagine be troubling for them and feel quite distancing.
So why do you think it's important for civilians to understand what it's like for a soldier to kill?
I think on a few different levels. I think there's a political level in which they should understand that when war is discussed or declared, this will happen, that people will be sent to go do these things and find themselves in these situations, and then they'll have to deal with it afterwards, and that they should not, we all have to take some responsibility for this because it's our country. I think also there's such a casual use of war metaphors and imagery and video games and all the rest in popular culture that having people take a real square look at what war actually is and what it actually does and what it actually involves is important. And I think that, even on just a very personal level, understanding that there are guys like this out there now, and that it's really not enough to just say, thanks for your service, or I support the troops, or all the rest. I mean, that's shorthand for addressing them and addressing these things, and that if there really is going to be support, it should be based in a real understanding of the actual experience. And I think also it's good to understand with the training that is done and the kind of focus and kind of lethal energy and that's required to carry out this job. And this was one of the things I actually liked about American Sniper, that is useful in a tactical sense for commanders trying to carry out their objectives, but at the same time, those commanders have to control it. They have to figure out how do we as leaders direct that so it doesn't get out of hand in the worst case scenarios, and there have been a few where it turns into actual murder and just getting completely goes outside the boundaries of what's even acceptable in wartime. And that responsibility is not just on the battlefield. I mean, it goes back to whoever declares the war, who plans the war, who says this is a good idea, we should do this. All that stuff is part of it. So I think it's an interesting thing. And I was just talking to a friend about this regarding American Sniper with some of the criticisms that Chris Kyle he's barbaric and blah blah blah. Yes, but that was his job. And so what does that make the person who sent him there? I mean, to me, these are questions that are worth looking at. And if someone wants to understand what war really is, it's I think the onus is on them to look at these sorts of questions.
Well, Phil, where can readers learn more about your work?
Well, this is the big thing I've been working on over of late. The Kill Switch. It's on Amazon, and it's a Kindle single, but you don't need a Kindle to read it. There's a Kindle app, and you can download that, and then you can read it on anything. So, I would hope, hope anyone who wants to know more about this would have a look. I did a review of American Sniper for Foreign Policy. Older things. There's some stories on Time or National Geographic, and that can be tracked down, and then I'll have to figure out what I do next.
All right. Well, Phil Zabriskie, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Sure. Thank you, Brett. I really appreciate it.
Our guest today was Phil Zabriskie. He's the author of the Amazon single, The Kill Switch. You can find that on Amazon.com and download it to your Kindle app. It's just $2.99. recommend you go pick it up. It's a very fascinating and jarring read. You can follow Phil on Twitter at